The glass of Hennessy was not a drink of comfort, it was a ritual of focus. The amber liquid, catching the low light of the apartment, wasn't meant to dull the senses but to sharpen them, to burn away the white-hot static of panic that would have consumed a lesser man. When the phone call came, the cold, Italian-accented voice delivering its ultimatum, $100,000 by midnight, or she comes back in pieces. The universe for most men would have collapsed into a single, narrow tunnel of terror. The world would have shrunk to the sound of that voice, the image of a loved one in peril, the frantic scrambling desperation to comply. For Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the world did the opposite. It expanded. He set the phone down slowly, the click of the receiver a period at the end of their sentence, not his story. The threat hung in the air, palpable and vile, in the silence that followed. His lieutenant, Illinois Gordon, watched him, waiting for the eruption, the smashing of furniture, the roared orders to gather every gun in Harlem. That's what the men in the black Lincoln Continental would have expected. That's what the faceless voice on the phone was counting on, the predictable chaotic rage of a man cornered, a man emotionally compromised, a man who could be manipulated through fear. Bumpy poured the Hennessy with a steady hand. The quiet glug-glug of the bottle was the only sound. He took the glass, felt its weight, and brought it to his lips. The sip was not a gulp, it was a taste. A deliberate sensory act that anchored him in the present moment, in his own body, in his own power. The burn down his throat was a reminder, you are here, you are alive, you are in control. He let the warmth spread in his chest, a counter to the ice now forming in his gut. He looked at Illinois, whose own anxiety was barely contained, and then he spoke. 4 words, delivered not with a snarl, not with a shout, but with the calm, measured cadence of a man giving the most important order of his life. Get me my coat. Those 4 words were the first move in a high-stakes game they thought they were running. They were not an expression of panic, but the declaration of it. In that simple phrase, get me my coat, was a universe of meaning. It meant, the time for waiting is over. The preparation is complete. We are now going to war. It was the equivalent of a general, hearing the first report of enemy artillery, calmly saying, begin the counteroffensive. The coat wasn't just clothing, it was armor. It was the uniform he would wear to descend into the underworld and retrieve what was his. It was the symbol of transition, from the domestic space, violated now by their intrusion, to the battlefield of the New York streets. This legendary calm was not indifference. It was the opposite. It was the absolute concentration of a lifetime's worth of fury, channeled into a diamond-hard point of action. To understand that calm is to understand who Bumpy Johnson was in 1959. He was not a hothead. He was a chess master who had been playing against the house, white America, the Italian mob, corrupt city officials, for 3 decades. He had learned that emotion was a liability. Rage made you stupid, fear made you slow, panic made you predictable. Every move he had made, from facing down Dutch Schultz to building his numbers empire into a community institution, was calculated. He operated on a different clock, with a different rhythm, than the brash, impulsive gangsters of storybooks. The kidnappers, professionals though they were operating on a simple, brutal timetable: apply pressure, create fear, collect money. They saw time as their ally, the ticking clock tightening the noose around Bumpy's neck. But Bumpy, in his utter stillness after the call, seized control of time itself. By not reacting as they anticipated, he broke their narrative. That moment of silence on the other end of the dead phone line, the moment where they expected to hear screams or pleas or the sound of furniture overturning, was the first crack in their operation. They were left wondering, in that silence, if the connection had been cut. They were left unsettled. His calm was a weapon that immediately put them on the back foot. It communicated something terrifying to anyone who understood the language of power. You have not surprised me. You have activated me. The sip of Hennessy, the measured tone, the request for his coat. These were the actions of a man walking into a known room, not stumbling in the dark. As Illinois helped him into the coat, smoothing the shoulders of the fine wool overcoat, the transformation was complete. The domestic man, the husband, was receding. The institution, the force of nature known as Bumpy Johnson, was stepping forth. This composure was the bedrock upon which the legend of the next 4 hours was built. Every decision that followed, the strategic phone calls made not from a place of hysteria but from cold analysis, the mobilization of his network not through shouted commands but through quiet, unequivocal instructions, the chillingly precise identification of the perpetrators, stemmed from that initial, unshakable center. He didn't have to become the fearsome gangster in response to the threat. He simply had to unleash the one who had been patiently waiting, watching, and planning for this exact contingency. The legend isn't about what he did in his rage, it's about what he accomplished in his absolute terrifying calm. The coat was on, The clock was ticking, and for the first time the men who took Marisol Johnson began to feel a chill that had nothing to do with the March night. They had wanted to see a monster provoked. They were about to meet the one who had been calmly waiting for them all along. The chloroform rag that silenced Marisol Johnson's scream did more than stifle a single voice. It was an act of profound, catastrophic ignorance. The four men with Italian accents, professionals who moved with brutal efficiency, believed they were grabbing leverage. They saw a well-dressed woman in a Harlem apartment, a wife, a possession, a high-value token to be exchanged for cash. In their calculus, drawn from the ledgers of Little Italy, she was a means to an end, a way to finally crack the nut of Harlem's numbers racket and humble the proud black king who guarded it. They did not understand, could not possibly comprehend, that in laying hands on Marisol, they were not seizing an asset. They were desecrating a shrine. They had crossed a line that wasn't merely criminal, it was sacrilegious. To touch Marisol Claire Johnson was to touch the living heart of Harlem itself. She was not an appendage to Bumpy's power. She was its cornerstone, its living legacy. Her mother was Stephanie St. Clair, the legendary Madam Queen, a figure of near mythic stature. In the 1920s and 30s, when Harlem was a playground for white gangsters like Dutch Schultz who saw its residents as sheep to be sheared, Stephanie St. Clair stood alone. She built her numbers bank from nothing, with a fierce intelligence and an unbreakable will. She didn't just run a racket, she waged a one-woman war for sovereignty. She took out full-page ads in the Amsterdam News naming corrupt cops who shook her down. She Clyde challenged and outmaneuvered Schultz, refusing to pay tribute, showing a terrified community that resistance was possible. She wasn't just a businesswoman, she was a revolutionary who proved that black power could be built, financed, and defended. When Bumpy Johnson, the brilliant and strategic enforcer, married Marisol in 1948, it was not a simple romance. It was a merger of dynasties. It was the union of street-level genius with regal inherited legitimacy. Bumpy brought the muscle, the political acumen, the day-to-day control. Marisol brought the unimpeachable lineage, the direct connection to the source of Harlem's self-determination. Their marriage represented the culmination of a 30-year struggle for autonomy. It symbolized that the empire built by a black woman could be protected and expanded by a black man, that the community's fortune would remain in the community's hands. She was Harlem royalty in the truest sense. Her authority was born not from fear, but from history, from struggle, from a legacy of defiant success. This context was the oxygen of Harlem's underworld, but it was a closed book to the Genovese crew. Vito Genovese and his lieutenant, Vincent the Chin Gigante, saw the world through a narrow, transactional lens of territories and tributes. Their concept of power was vertical, hierarchical, and extractive. They believed that with enough pressure, any independent operation would buckle and become a vassal state. They viewed Bumpy as a stubborn, but ultimately local, problem. A colored boss who had been lucky for too long. In their strategy sessions, Marisol was downgraded to a pressure point, a vulnerability to be exploited. They failed to see that in targeting her, they were not applying pressure to a single man, but declaring war on an entire idea. For the people of Harlem, the shopkeepers Bumpy kept afloat, the families whose rent he quietly paid, the thousands who placed their daily nickels and dimes in the numbers game he operated, Marisol was a symbol of their collective dignity. She walked the streets not with a bodyguard's scowl, but with a regal bearing that spoke of a heritage they all shared in. To harm her was to spit on the memory of Madam Queen's defiance. It was to tell every person in Harlem that their hard-won autonomy was a fiction, that their heroes could be humiliated, that their legacy was hostage to any thug with a chloroform rag and a gun. The kidnapping was, therefore, the ultimate communal insult. This is why Bumpy's response had to be, and was, more than a rescue mission. It had to be a restoration of sacred order. A mere payoff would have been an unforgivable sin. It would have monetized the legacy of Stephanie St. Clair. It would have turned a queen's daughter into a commodity with a price tag, validating the kidnapper's entire worldview. Retrieving Marisol through a cash exchange was impossible, not logistically, but spiritually. Harlem's pride, its very sense of self, was in that true NK of the Black Lincoln Continental along with her. So when Bumpy received that call, his cold fury was not solely that of a husband. It was the fury of a guardian, a steward of history. The men who took her had mistaken the surface for the substance. They saw a wealthy gangster's wife. They did not see the daughter of the woman who had stared down the Dutchman. They did not see the human embodiment of a community's 30-year journey from exploitation to self-rule. Their demand for $100,000 was almost quaint in its inadequacy. How do you put a price on a symbol? How do you ransom a revolution? the legend of what Bumpy did in the next 4 hours is so potent precisely because it was an act of cosmic rebalancing. He wasn't just going to get his wife back, he was going to teach a brutal object lesson about the nature of the power they had so foolishly provoked. The power he wielded was not stored in vaults or measured in muscle alone. It was woven into the fabric of the neighborhood, in the loyalty of every person who owed him a favor, in the silent gratitude of a widow on 132nd Street, in the collective memory of who her mother was and what her mother had done. The kidnappers had stolen a person. To get her back, Bumpy would mobilize a people. Their crime was a violation of family. His response would be delivered by the entire extended family of Harlem. They had touched something they believed was precious metal, not realizing it was a live wire connected to the very soul of a city within a city. And in doing so, they guaranteed their own destruction, not just by Bumpy's hand, but by the terrifying weight of the history they had been too arrogant to learn. The kidnappers believed in a simple, brutal arithmetic of power: muscle, money, fear. These were the currencies traded in the social clubs of Little Italy, the tangible assets that built empires and enforced tribute. When they snatched Marisol, Johnson, they were applying a classic formula: identify the thing a man loves most, threaten its destruction, and watch him crumble into compliance. They were practitioners of transactional power, a straightforward economy of violence where everything, even a life, even a legacy, had a price. They believed Bumpy Johnson operated in the same marketplace. They were catastrophically wrong. Bumpy understood a different kind of power entirely, one they could not seize, could not buy, and ultimately could not withstand. For Vito Genovese and Vincent Gigante, power was a structure you imposed from the outside. It was extractive. It flowed one way, from the streets, from the numbers runners, from the policy slips, upward into the family's coffers. It required constant demonstration, a body in a gutter, a burned-out storefront, a public beating. Its goal was submission, its method was intimidation, and its foundation was the cold fact that most people, when terrified enough, will choose survival over principle. This was the power they knew, and by its logic, this air move was flawless. Apply maximum pressure to the central pillar, Bumpy, and the entire structure of Harlem would buckle. But Harlem under Bumpy Johnson was not a structure imposed from above. It was an ecosystem, deeply rooted and mutually sustaining. Bumpy's power was not extractive, it was reinvestive. It circulated. The nickels and dimes from the numbers game didn't just vanish downtown. They paid a widow's rent on 132nd Street. They bought coal for tenements in winter. They sponsored a local baseball team, put shoes on kids for school, floated loans to black-owned businesses that white banks redlined. His power was not demonstrated through random terror, but through visible, consistent protection. He wasn't just a boss, he was a patron, a benefactor, a social contract made flesh. The fear he commanded was laced with something far more potent and durable: respect, loyalty, and a fierce proprietary love. This was the chasm of misunderstanding that doomed the Genovese operation. They saw a criminal enterprise. Bumpy presided over a parallel society. They had soldiers. Bumpy had constituents. When their enforcers walked into a bar in Harlem, the room went silent with dread, eyes dropped, conversations froze. When Bumpy walked down 125th Street, the reaction was different. A nod, a tipped hat, a quiet Mr. Johnson. The silence that greeted him was not fear of the man himself, but a respectful deference to the office he held, the role he played. He was the mayor, the judge, and the social safety net. His power was relational, woven into 1,000 daily interactions, 1,000 quiet debts of gratitude. You cannot kidnap that. You cannot put a price on that. You can only provoke it into a unified, devastating response. The Italian's power was like a hammer, devastating upon impact, but useless unless actively swung. Bumpy's power was like the ground beneath Harlem's feet, invisible, ever-present, and the source of all stability. The hammer could shatter a window, but it could not make the earth tremble. When they took Marisol, they swung their hammer at what they thought was a wall. They did not realize they were striking the ground itself, and the tremor would travel through every root and fiber of the community they sought to conquer. This fundamental miscalculation shaped every second of the 4-hour legend. The kidnappers operated on a need-to-know basis. Their crew was small, professional, isolated. They waited for their phone to ring with Bumpy's panicked voice ready to dictate terms to a broken man. But Bumpy did not need to make calls to gather information. He needed only to receive them. His power was a web, and the moment the central strand was plucked, the entire network vibrated. The news did not travel as a rumor, it traveled as a mobilization order. The old woman who saw the black Lincoln idling too long became an intelligence asset. The shoeshine boy who noted the specific timbre of an accent became a scout. The cab driver Ho caught a partial plate became a relay point. This wasn't an organization he commanded through a chain of lieutenants. It was an organism that reacted to a threat to its own. The Genovese men understood betrayal. They dealt with rats and informants who traded secrets for money or mercy. They could not conceptualize loyalty that was not purchased through fear or profit. They could not fathom that. People would take immense personal risk not for a payoff from Bumpy, but for Bumpy, for what he represented, for the delicate order he maintained that allowed their lives to function. When Bumpy, coat now on, began his quiet work, he wasn't activating a roster of hired guns. He was tapping into a collective sense of outrage. The insult was not just his, it was communal. Marisol's abduction was an eviction notice served on all of Harlem's hard-won dignity. In their transactional worldview, the resolution was a trade, money for a life, a business deal, albeit a violent one. But for Bumpy, this was never going to be a transaction. It was to be a restoration. A transaction would have legitimized their worldview, admitting that even the sacred could be commodified. A restoration would prove his power's superior nature. He wouldn't just buy her back, he would reclaim her, demonstrating that their kind of power, the kind that required hiding in safe houses, using chloroform rags, and making midnight calls, was a weak, pathetic thing next to the power that flows from being known, being root. Ed, being the man who is the street. The legend of those 4 hours, then, is the story of two philosophies of power colliding with absolute force. On one side, the cold, efficient, isolated power of the syndicate, all levers and threats. On the other, the warm, deep, entangled power of a community king. One could be calculated with a ledger, the other could only be measured by its eruption. The kidnappers had the leverage of a single terrified life. Bumpy had the leverage of an entire world that life symbolized. They thought they were playing a high-stakes game of kidnapping and ransom. They were unwittingly starring in a parable, about to learn that the most formidable force in any city is not the one that takes, but the one that gives. Not the one that inspires fear in strangers, but the one that commands the allegiance of a home. They had the gun and the chloroform. He had Harlem. And in the economy of real power, that was not a fair fight. The silence in the apartment after the phone went dead was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of a theater after the final line of a play has been delivered, and the players hold their positions, awaiting the curtain. The kidnappers, in their black Lincoln, speeding towards some anonymous safe house in New Jersey or the Bronx, believed they had just delivered the opening act. They had seized the initiative, controlled the narrative, and set the clock ticking. They were the playwrights of this drama, and they expected Bumpy J. Ounson to now stumble through the script they had written. A script of panic, of frantic money gathering, of desperate negotiation ending in a humiliating payoff. What they did not know, what they could not have conceived, was that Bumpy had not only read their script weeks ago, he had written an entirely different ending. Their phone call was not a provocation, it was his cue. For 3 weeks, the air in Harlem had carried a specific metallic taste of Bumpy Johnson. It was the taste of a pending storm, the scent of ozone before lightning splits the sky. The intelligence wasn't a single report, not a clear-cut betrayal whispered in a back room. It was a mosaic of small, unsettling shifts. A known Genovese button man, too casually browsing a haberdashery on Lenox Avenue he had no business in. A strange Lincoln with New Jersey plates, circling the neighborhood at odd hours, not committing to anything, just watching. Whispers from his connections in the police precinct, not about a specific threat, but about a new, edgy agitation from the Italian crews downtown, a pressure from the top to get creative on the Harlem problem. Most tellingly, there had been a subtle, probing shift in the pattern of their aggression. The usual strong-arm attempts on his runners had stopped. The political pressure via crooked councilmen had quieted. It was as if they had ceased pushing against the outer walls of his kingdom, and were now looking for a seam, a hidden door, to a less sophisticated end. This might have seemed like retreat. To Bumpy, it signaled a dangerous escalation. They were moving from brute force to strategy. And in the underworld, when your enemy switches tactics, you ask one question: what is the new target? It didn't take a genius. They had tried everything else. They had failed to touch his business, his political armor, his street forces. There was, in the cruel calculus of their world, only one target left that was both supremely valuable and potentially vulnerable: his home, his heart. Marisol. So, for 21 days, Bumpy Johnson had lived in a state of poised, meticulous anticipation. He was a chess grandmaster who has foreseen his opponent's only viable checkmate attempt from 10 moves away. He did not change his routine outwardly. He still held court at his restaurants, still took his walks, still conducted his business. But inwardly, and within his innermost circle, a counter-operation was being quietly constructed. It was not a plan to prevent a kidnapping. That would have been impossible against determined professionals without living in a fortress, and Bumpy refused to be a prisoner in his own domain. No, it was a plan for the moment after. A trap designed not to catch a mouse, but to annihilate the hand that reached into the cage. This is the core of the legend that history books miss. The story is not one of brilliant improvised reaction. It is a story of supreme, patient strategy. The kidnappers were the active agents, but the why were dancing on a stage Bumpy had secretly reinforced to collapse under them. When they grabbed Marisol, they believed they were executing a bold, unexpected masterstroke. In reality, they were springing the jaws of a trap that had been waiting, oiled and open, for weeks. Every detail of their operation, which they believed spoke of their professionalism, became a data point fed into a pre-existing machine. The 90-second extraction? He had anticipated the need for speed and had discreetly arranged for certain eyes on the street, a tired window washer working late, a teen sweeping a stoop, to be unusually observant of vehicles moving with purpose at that hour. The Italian accents? He had already narrowed down which Genovese crew, known for its Sicilian-born soldiers, was both reckless and ambitious enough to try it. The black Lincoln Continental? A rare, conspicuous car. He had already, through channels, made certain that such a vehicle, if spotted in unusual contexts, would be remembered and reported not to the police, but through the Harlem Telegraph, directly to Illinois Gordon. When the call came at 7:02 p.m., the emotion Bumpy had to conquer was not surprise, but a grim, vindicated fury. They had actually done it. They were that stupid. The sip of Hennessy was to settle the adrenaline of the hunt finally being joined. "Get me my coat," was the command to move from Phase 1, preparation, to Phase 2, execution. What followed in the next 4 hours appeared to the outside world, and to the terrified kidnappers waiting for their instructions, as a supernatural demonstration of reach and intelligence. How could he possibly know? How could he move so fast? It seemed like magic, like he had a demon on every corner. But it wasn't magic. It was the cold, hard science of preparation meeting opportunity. The phone calls he made were not shots in the dark. They were activating specific nodes in a network he had pre-wired. The questions he asked were not hopeful probes. They were requests for confirmation on hunches he'd already formed. The pieces of the puzzle. The likely safe houses, flats owned by shell companies linked to Genovese captains, the possible middlemen, a corrupt lawyer known to handle delicate disputes. The psychological profile of the lead kidnapper, likely Gigante, hungry for a big score, were already on the table. The abduction simply showed him how they had chosen to assemble them. The kidnappers, sitting in their musty safe house, watching over a silently defiant Marisol, were waiting for their script to unfold. They expected Act 2 to be Bumpy's desperate plea for more time, or his attempt to negotiate. The phone, when it rang, would be their instrument. But the genius of Bumpy's counter-gambit was that he refused to play his part in their drama. He was writing his own, and in his play, they were not the cunning antagonists. They were the doomed prey who had wandered, obliviously, into a hunter's perfectly laid snare. Their confidence, as the minutes ticked past 8 p.m., then 9 p.m., without the expected call, began to curdle into a gnawing anxiety. The silence from their victim was all wrong. It wasn't the silence of defeat. It was the silence of the forest just before the predator strikes. They had wanted to make him a reactive animal, driven by fear. Instead, by anticipating their every move, he had rendered them passive, waiting, sweating in the quiet dark, the most vulnerable position of all. They thought they had taken the initiative. In truth, from the moment they grabbed her, they had lost it forever, because every single step they took was on the path he had already mapped for them. The final, chilling lesson was not delivered with a public spectacle, not bodies left displayed on Mulberry Street, as a gory declaration. That was the old language, the crude vernacular of gangland theatrics that Bumpy Johnson had long since transcended. The lesson of those 4 hours was administered with a terrifying surgical precision that didn't just punish an act, but rewrote an entire understanding of the city's power grid. It was a lesson that didn't merely echo through the back rooms of New York's underworld. It forced a fundamental, humiliating reevaluation. By midnight, on March 14, 1959, the Italian mob didn't just know they had failed. They were forced to question everything they thought they knew about control, about territory, and about the very nature of the man they had dared to challenge. For decades, the five families had operated on a foundational assumption that New York was a pyramid, and they were its apex. Neighborhoods were territories to be controlled, businesses were ventures to be taxed, independent operators were either absorbed or erased. Their power was centrifugal, pulling everything toward their center. Harlem, with its river of cash from the numbers game, was a glaring, irritating exception, a stubborn, self-sustaining solar system orbiting a different sun. Their attempts to pull it into their gravitational field had all failed, culminating in the desperate, ugly tactic of kidnapping. They viewed this as an escalation, a demonstration of their ruthless will. What Bumpy's response demonstrated was that their entire framework was flawed. Harlem wasn't a rogue province, it was a sovereign nation, and he wasn't a local chieftain, he was a head of state with a different, more potent kind of authority. The legend of the 4-hour retrieval, the uncanny pinpointing of the location, the silent mobilization of forces that left no witness, the safe return of Marisol without a single shot fired in her vicinity, and the subsequent, unmistakable message delivered to the kidnappers themselves, served as a brutal case study. It proved that their power, for all its fearsome reputation, had hard limits. It was power that operated through hierarchy, which meant it was slow, prone to leaks, and bound by protocol. A captain had to get permission, soldiers had to be paid, informants had to be cultivated. Bumpy's power, as he displayed that night, was organic and instantaneous. It was the power of a social fabric so tightly woven that a tear in one thread was felt and repaired by the entire cloth. He didn't need permission, he was the permission. His soldiers weren't mercenaries, they were citizens defending their own. The aftermath sent a seismic shudder through the commission. The details were murky, deliberately so, which made them all the more potent. The rumors that did leak were not of a bloody shootout, but of something far more disquieting, of Bumpy's men materializing at the exact improbable safe house in Riverdale, of the kidnappers being found, not dead, but profoundly and symbolically new. Tralized, stripped of their weapons, their money, and their dignity, with a message delivered not in words, but in the sheer impossible fact of their discovery. The word that circulated wasn't revenge, it was knowledge. He knew. He knew where they were, who had sent them, before they had even finished their first nervous cigarette in that safe house. This implied a penetration, an intelligence network within their own world, that was far more frightening than any display of brute force. A bullet you can dodge, an enemy who sees your every move before you make it is a phantom you cannot fight. For Genovese, already paranoid and consolidating his own power, the incident was a profound personal and strategic humiliation. It revealed the fragility of his command. A high-stakes operation, signed off on at the highest levels, had not just failed, it had been turned into a masterclass in its own incompetence. It showed his captains that his ambitions could be made to look foolish, that his most ruthless lieutenant Gigante could be outmaneuvered on what should have been his own cunning terrain. The pressure to respond, to save face, would have been immense. And yet, the credible stories say there was no retaliatory strike. The order was to stand down, to let it go. This was perhaps the most eloquent part of Bumpy's lesson. He forced them into silence. The cost of further escalation, they implicitly calculated, was too high. They had touched the core of his power, and found it not soft, but molten and reactive. To continue would mean a war not on a single man, but on an entire motivated populace, a messy, unwinnable street war that would draw heat from every direction. In the years that followed, a new, unspoken demarcation was respected. The Genovese family's ambitions in Harlem didn't disappear, but they were channeled, muted. They might skim from the edges, do business with independent operators on the periphery, but the core of Bumpy's kingdom, the numbers banks, the loyalty of the street, the person of Marisol Johnson, was understood to be verboten. It was no longer worth the risk. They had learned that Bumpy Johnson's power was not the kind you could take by force, because its source was not in a warehouse or a ledger. Its source was in the will of a people. You could, theoretically, assassinate a king, but how do you assassinate a legend? How do you kill the trust of a neighborhood? The lesson of those 4 hours became underworld lore, a story told not to glorify violence, but to illustrate a terrifying principle of sovereignty. It taught that there are different currencies of power. The Italians dealt in fear and cash. Bumpy Johnson dealt in loyalty and legacy. That night proved, irrevocably, which currency held its value in a crisis. It forced the mob to look at their maps of New York and, with grudging, furious respect, draw a permanent circle around Harlem with a single silent label, Johnson's Land. They could own Manhattan, they could own the docks, they could own the unions, but they had been schooled in the most expensive way possible that some ground cannot be bought or taken. It can only be earned and defended by a man who is not just a gangster, but the living embodiment of a community's unbreakable will. That was the lesson. And for generations in the underworld, It was one they never forgot.